Hola, buenos días. Esto es una grabación, nosotros estamos grabando de mañana, pero buenos días o buenas tardes o buenas noches, según el momento en que estén viendo esto. Estamos con su Friedrich en el marco del FEMCINE número 12. Este año el FEMCINE tiene un foco dedicado a ella, que va a tener funciones presenciales y online, presenciales en Santiago de Chile y online con geolocalización para Chile, con acceso y entrada gratuita. Ahora les vamos a contar un poquito cómo está conformado el programa, pero pueden encontrar toda la información en femcine.cl. Thank you, Sue, for being here with us. I will introduce you and then we go to the questions. Sue Friedrich, para quienes no la conocen, es una persona fundamental para el cine lésbico-queer. En nuestra idea, la manera que ella tuvo de introducir algunos temas con respecto a la visibilidad de las vidas lesbianas, a la heterosexualidad obligatoria, a cuestionar la heteronormatividad, es muy importante, a la vez que utilizó recursos nuevos e interesantes a la hora de contar, esto es cruzando partes narrativas, partes documentales, utilizando archivo personal, archivo encontrado, también entrevistas, me atrevo a decir también poesía. Friedrich trabaja en Nueva York y filma desde 1978. En general, muchas de sus piezas, y las 4 que vamos a mostrar en el foco, están filmadas en 16 milímetros. Es hija de una madre alemana, estudió en una escuela de monjas, se enamoró de una de ellas en un momento. Parte de esos temas forman parte de su filmografía. Así que les puedo pasar a presentar las cuatro pelis que vamos a ver. Son un cortometraje y 3 largometrajes. El primero que van a poder ver se llama Cool Hands, Warm Heart. Trata un poco de sacar al espacio público ciertas prácticas de las feminidades, como afeitarse, por ejemplo, lo que termina construyendo un erotismo, cierta inquietud. Esto sucede en el medio de Nueva York. Muy recomendable quizás ver este corto para iniciarse en su filmografía. Si bien es muchísimo más extensa la filmografía de Sue, tenemos estas 4 piezas que nos parece que son un buen acercamiento a su obra completa. Después hay 2 películas que las leemos un poco como encadenadas. Una quizás es su película más conocida, que se llama Hide and Seek, y la siguiente se llama Sink or Swim. Hide and Seek habla de una niñez lesbiana. Es la historia de una niña que empieza a descubrir su lesbianismo, y mechada con historias de otras lesbianas. Nos parece un gran gesto detectar y retratar ese momento de la vida de las lesbianas. Todas las lesbianas recordamos momentos de nuestra niñez en el cual detectamos algo de esto. Es muy hermosa la película. Y Sink or Swim quizás va un poquito más allá, es bastante más amplia y empieza como a hablar con ciertas categorías, instituciones, el padre, la familia, la educación, y un montón de palabras que Su describe en imagen y en sonido de una manera muy interesante. Y por último, la 4ª película que forma este foco se llama The Odds of Recovery. Es una película de una de las más recientes que hemos programado. Es una película sobre Sue y una condición médica que la lleva a tener que ir muchísimas veces a tratar de vincularse con la institución médica, todo lo que eso significa, y que funciona un poco como metáfora de todo el resto de las instituciones y como de cierto funcionamiento que tenemos en este mundo. Así que bueno, entre todos estos cruces podemos empezar con la primera pregunta, que tiene que ver con el proceso creativo, con cómo utilizando estos distintos soportes, estas distintas maneras de contar, el documental, lo personal, la palabra escrita, varias de las películas de Su se comunican con palabra escrita. No es el caso de estas dos pelis, pero muchas de ellas, digamos, como que eso es parte de su identidad. O sea, ¿desde dónde se parte? Si se parte desde un guión, o si se parte, cómo esas imágenes van tomando forma para contar finalmente lo que se quiere contar. So I will read for you the question in English, so you can answer for us. And how was or is your creative process using either documentary materials, archives, poetry, dialogues with other people, interviews, and material of your personal life? The question is about the strategy to organize all these materials, if you come from a script or from ideas, and how they end up all together.
Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you. My films really haven't shown in Chile before, so it's really exciting that you're doing this. I'm really happy about it. And also happy that you're having a women's film festival, because there used to be so many of them and now there are very few of them. So this is really great. My process is, it changes from film to film, but it's also maybe the same in all of them, which is that I start with an idea. I don't really have a whole idea when I begin. It's just a question, what was it like with my father? What is it like for children to talk about their relationship with their father? What was the experience of lesbians when they were children? What is fear and how do you deal with fear? Like Cool Hands, Warm Heart was a lot about fear. The Odds of Recovery was just thinking that I had gone through many different medical situations, and I hadn't really taken into account what that meant for me or for my partner. And so I wanted to look back at it. And after I get the idea, I just start imagining what the images might be, what the text might be. And you mentioned poetry, and I would say sometimes I read poetry, but I read a lot of literature. And so I do have quite a relationship to the written word. So if it isn't a film where I'm interviewing people, like in Hide and Seek, I did a lot of interviews, but in other films, I think I'll have some sort of text. Sometimes it would be on the screen, like in Cool Hands, Warm Heart, or in Sink or Swim, there are all these stories that I tell. And I work for a long time, to write those pieces. And then sometimes the way I shoot is very planned, and sometimes it's just the chance of life. In Sink or Swim, I needed footage of fathers with their children, or I don't know, there's so many films and so many ways of shooting, but I just go out in the world to find what I need. And I also go out to film things that I don't know yet will be a part of a film and then become a part of it, or sometimes don't, or I think they're for one film and I use them in another film. So before Sink or Swim, I made Damned If You Don't, and I had all this footage of kids in a Catholic, in a church having their first Holy Communion that didn't fit into Damned If You Don't. So I used it for a scene in Sink or Swim. So it's in a way a very open approach, and in other ways it's very strict or structured. But I would say there's just a long process of collecting and thinking and writing. And all of that. And then really it's in the editing. The editing is such a big part of how the films get put together. I spend, you know, Sink or Swim took me a year to edit. Hide and Seek took more than a year, you know, so it really gets built in the editing room.
Thank you. So another question maybe we can do later, it's about how it's like to work by yourself or with others. I read that you mostly edit and film and write the movies. So maybe if you want,
if you want to ask that again in Spanish, and then I'll answer it because that's a good question.
Okay. La pregunta para Su, a propósito de lo que decía, era cómo maneja esto de ser quien escribe, edita y guiona muchas veces. Muchas de sus películas están hechas enteramente por ella. Y digamos, la pregunta viene por el lado de, bueno, ¿cuál sería la diferencia o qué es lo que ella siente cuando trabaja colectivamente o cuando trabaja sola, digamos?
Yeah, yeah, I said that's a good question because it's something, particularly if I'm talking to filmmakers. So if there are any filmmakers watching this, I have always depended a lot on other people. So even though I don't make fiction films, except let's say Hide and Seek, where there's a cast and there's a writer or whatever, nobody should ever think that I make these films myself, because from the beginning, I'm certainly talking with a few people. And when I'm writing, I'm showing the writing to a few people. When I'm editing, definitely, because I never went to film school. I only had 3 nights of a little film workshop at a place in New York. But it was after college and school was very expensive. And I thought, well, I'll learn this myself. And right away at this workshop, where I was renting camera equipment and editing and stuff, there were other filmmakers around, and I became friends with them. And I would start to say, oh, do you want to look at this? Do you want to look at that? And I realized that particularly when you're working with personal material, although I think it's true for any kind of film, but you don't have a distance, you know, you're not objective. You're talking about your partner or your parents or whatever it is. And you can become very closed in and only be telling the story that you know. And it's really important to reach out and say, you know, like, let's say with Sink or Swim, I showed the script and also the film to my sister and my brother. And I said, well, what was your experience like with Dad? You know, and it has made all the difference. There have been so many ways in which people who are, maybe it's another filmmaker, maybe a writer, or somebody in the family, my partner, where they step in and they say, this isn't true, or you're doing this in a sort of sentimental way. You know, you're not being honest. You're not being funny, whatever it is that they see. And I don't always agree, but I definitely take a lot of advice and I make a lot of changes because of that. Yeah.
Thank you. And talking about the themes you talk in your movies, I will say this in Spanish.
Yeah.
First. Hablando de los temas que Su aborda, en general, muchas veces ella está dentro de lo que podríamos llamar el espectro queer, lésbico, y la pregunta que queríamos, o sea, como sus materiales aparecen en un momento en que estas identidades estaban muy poco representadas, queríamos preguntarle sobre la voluntad de escribir alguna suerte de contrahistoria, y un poco hablar de, o sea, el ojo queer versus el male gaze, ¿no? Como la mirada masculina. Y en este sentido, una de las preguntas, esto habría como varias preguntas, y una de las preguntas que queríamos hacerle es cómo poder ser disruptivo de alguna manera en un mundo tan asimilacionista. Y ahora le voy a leer la pregunta a Su en inglés. Su, the question was about the themes of interest that appear in your films that are generally inside a queer feminist spectrum, crossed by broader things such education. And sometimes it seems to have the intention of founding a counter history. And I was thinking about the queer eye opposite to the male gaze. And in relation to this, I was asking myself, and I ask you, how can we be disruptive in those days and nowadays also, in such an assimilationist, I don't know yeah, I don't know if I can tell that word in English. So that's the first question.
Well, you know, it's interesting to ask that question now in the mid 20th century, right? Compared to when I was starting to work in, you know, 1980, let's say, like, you know, late 1970s, because things are in a way very different, just more in terms of capitalism than anything else. Because back then, clearly, we all know this, you know, film was controlled by men. Most of the stories were written about men, by men. Stories about women were written by men, and they weren't usually true. You know, it was just a huge problem. And so when I began, within the context of the experimental film world, which was smaller, it wasn't controlled by studio heads and funders, you know, big funders. So all of us could work much more openly and freely and say the things we wanted to say. And for me and a lot of other filmmakers at the time, it was just obvious that if that was the history that we had been seeing, that we needed to make our own work. And in the context then, there were many more women's film festivals. There were then starting to be gay and lesbian film festivals. So it felt like the work was available to people even before streaming. You know, people still had to go to the movie theaters, and so it didn't feel like we were being sort of you know, absorbed by the bigger, you know, capitalist world, but we existed alongside it, and anybody who was interested could come and see the work. If they weren't interested, they didn't. By now, and then of course, all of the kind of things we were talking about, the stories we were telling, became a little bit more part of the mainstream. And then you started having movies made in Hollywood or where else in the world that was like Hollywood, that seemed to be like the kinds of things we were doing, but they weren't very much like that. You know, they were cleaned up. They were, you know, we know what I mean. And so by now, I think that's so much a part of what we live in that in a way, you just make the choice. You think, well, I could, you know, get $2 million from Netflix and make a very superficial film about what I'm thinking about, or I could continue to work in the way I do. And so I think it's an individual choice. And what can I say? We just, people should continue working and telling stories that they believe in, without expecting that that's then going to be the main story that's told. There are just millions of stories being told, and we can't control the situation that much. You can only control what you make, and see what happens afterwards, I think.
Yeah, I guess the answer is to keep independent, right? That's kind of what she's saying. Le decía a Su que quizás la respuesta es mantenerse independientes, ¿no? Que quizás en esa línea iba su respuesta. También queríamos preguntarle con respecto a la categoría de cine experimental, que muchas veces su cine es catalogado como cine experimental, y he leído cómo ella problematiza un poco esta categoría, diciendo que esa es una manera como de correr un poco de la historia, este tipo de materiales, que para ella no se trata de experimentos, sino que se trata de otra manera de filmar. Entonces, le queríamos preguntar si podía ampliar un poquito este tema. So I will read for you. I have read how much you problematize the idea of your work as experimental, stating that this is not about experiments, but about making cinema in a non-classical way, with a sophisticated aesthetic and a voice of your own that also constitutes a political position. So I want to ask you if you can explain or be more broad about this subject.
Well, the other question you had in that part was about whether I think that you can be objective in making a documentary, and I can also answer that. So to the question of objectivity, I think men have pretended that they could be objective. You know, men are scientific and rational and all this stuff. And so for, 80 or 100 years, they've gone out into the world, let's say with documentary, and kind of mostly behaved as if they could remain apart from their subject, and that their approach to the subject didn't reflect their own feeling and thinking, except in the best way, like, oh, I care about this subject, and that's why I'm making this film. But that their interaction didn't make any difference. Well, that's nonsense. Everybody who makes art makes it from themselves, even if they're making it about some people or something that isn't exactly like them. And I think there's been a real understanding in the last 10 or 20 years that that is nonsense, and that people have to recognize their role in it. I mean, the classic thing is the minute you turn on a camera, you change the atmosphere of a situation, right? You can't, it's not going to be the same. And beyond that, the minute you turn on a camera and you're a, whatever you are, a white man in somewhere, it's gonna affect it. So I never worked in a way that assumed that I could be objective. I always knew that my place in the story was part of the story. And then I could choose how much of it would be part of the story. But at least I understood that it was part of it. And I also think it's sort of like with fiction, when you read fiction by men, and that's why it's so great that Flaubert said, I am Madame Bovary. When writers are writing about other characters, it still comes from their world, their position in the world. So enough about that. I think the problem with experimental is that, let's say in the 1950s and 1960s, or even the 40s, people who were making films outside of the studio system, and again, all around the world, not just in America, had to somehow call themselves something. And so they started being called avant-garde film or experimental film. And that kind of stuck. And it does, in a way, describe a certain body of work that really is apart from what we think of as a documentary or a fiction film, yeah. But there's so much slippage. Like you can pick a handful of people, and say, yeah, those are the experimental filmmakers. Stan Brakhage, Maya Deren. But suddenly, you have people working in ways, longer films or that introduce narrative or introduce documentary. And it starts to not really mean much anymore when you say, oh, that's an experimental film or that's an experimental documentary. And I have been, you know, confronted by this for 30 years now, where somebody wants to say, but now you're a documentary filmmaker, or now you're a hybrid filmmaker, or, you know, you make experimental documentaries, you know, and I just think in the end, like, I'm just a filmmaker. And I think scholars, people who are reviewing, they kind of need to put a name to something. And so I have sympathy for them. I recognize the need. If they use a term, I think, okay, fine. But for myself, for my sense of myself, I'm just a filmmaker. You know, I'm no different than Hitchcock when it comes down to it. Well, very different in many other ways, but so, you know, that's my thinking about it. Yeah. And in a way, even independent film now, indie filmmaking back in the 70s sort of made sense in relation to the studios. But at this point, you know, if somebody gets $10 million from Netflix to make a film, are they still an independent filmmaker? That's a lot of money. You know, so I think all of these terms, you use them, but you don't have to take them that seriously. Yeah.
Okay, I agree, and I was telling you by email that I appreciate that. Yeah, you are always in the middle. I guess, like, you are a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So my next question is maybe about it. Y la digo primero en castellano. La próxima pregunta tiene que ver con lo narrativo. Yo le decía a Sue en estos días que estuvimos cruzando mails que apreciaba mucho que ella siempre se encuentre un poco como en el medio de las cosas, ¿no? En las intersecciones, que sea un poquito de esto, un poquito de lo otro, un poco documental, un poco de su vida, un poco de entrevista, un poco experimental. Y en ese sentido, leyendo algunos textos, encontré que Sue hablaba de que a veces lo narrativo se le quedaba un poco corto. Y entonces, nada, quería preguntarle un poquito sobre esto. Ella lo que decía es que a veces no llegaba a representar como ciertos estados o climas. So I will say it to you in English. So I was telling that I appreciate that you always place yourself in betweens, in the crossroads, in the intersections. And the question was about how do you feel about this? And why would it seem that telling realistic stories are maybe sometimes are not enough to truly portray certain experiences as queer experiences or certain state of mind.
But my question was, what do you mean telling realistic stories? Oh, you have a cat also? I have a cat.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, he's kind of old.
So when you say telling realistic, you mean, what do you mean compared to?
I was reading some text you wrote, and you said that you, I don't know if you start filming or some of your films you were, you mentioned Fassbender, that he was the only one you could watch and not think that it's not enough of. I mean, like a realistic story about a queer person, maybe.
I see what you're saying. Okay, I see.
So
what you're saying.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I did love Fassbinder when I was young. He was a big influence when I was starting out making films. You know, the thing is, I don't think I place myself in the crossroads. I don't purposely decide to be in the middle of anything. It's that we each are who we are. And I don't know why, when I was born and as I was growing up, that I became the person I am. But certainly if you're young, you know, a girl in your teens and early 20s, and you're faced with this totally sexist society and racist society, and you want to speak, then you are going to be in the middle. You are going to be sort of outside of the mainstream. It's not like I thought, well, of course you think I don't want to be a part of this because you object to the standard way that people are. And so if you speak against it, then there you are, like over there somewhere. And I think it in a way, okay, I'm almost 68 years old, which is horrifying. And in a way, when I was 24 or 34, I did think that things would be really, really different soon. Yeah. The women's movement would change things. The civil rights movement would change things. The queer movement would change things. And now here we are, and there's much more good, but there's still a lot of bad. So maybe I thought before that I wouldn't have to keep making films the way I do, or talk about the kinds of things I do in my work as I got older. But I feel like I do have to keep talking about those things because I still see that, you know, there's a lot, let's say there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah.
Yes, my next question was, it's about maybe the future. And what are your concerns right now? What are you working at and what are you thinking about? La digo en español. La pregunta que venía siguiente, y justo eso nos da el pie también para hablar de esto, es, bueno, ¿cuáles son sus preocupaciones hoy? ¿En qué está trabajando? ¿No? Y qué es lo que le parece que hay que nombrar y mostrar hoy.
Well, in 2000, when did I finish it? 2014 or something, I finished a film about my mother. She was getting quite old, and it's called I Cannot Tell You How I Feel. And then I worked on, I made one website called Edited By, which is a survey of 206 women editors, because I felt that it was an important thing to do. And so that took about a year to make. And then at the start of the pandemic, I was contacted by, or I spoke with Louise Greaves, who is the widow of William Greaves, a very important Black American filmmaker. And the website needed to be updated, she said, and it needed to be completely redone. And so all the first year of the pandemic, I spent making this huge website about Bill Greaves' work. But at the same time, I had started two things. I started working on a new film, which I'm pretty much finished with, called Today. And it began by me thinking about how I could pay more attention to the present, you know, how I was too stressed out and, you know, not enjoying life and all of that. And so it started in a way, a slightly comical way, to be looking at what it means to just look out at life. And maybe without what I might say is an agenda. Like my shooting for other films was always for a subject, you know, and this one was just more sort of what's out in the world today that I might enjoy or be interested in. But it has kind of turned into also something about the fact that while I was making it, my mother died, and then my father died, and then a very close friend died. So in a way, it's about today. So it's called Today. And today is maybe a day when you see, you know, a beautiful spring flower. And today is also a day when your father dies. And you know, that's today, that's life. So I worked on that during the 5 years. I also, about 5 years ago, started writing a book. And when I was 21, I traveled for 4 months all through West Africa by myself. And I had journals and I took photographs because this was before I was a filmmaker. So I had a camera with me. And then I had all of this material for 41 years. And I decided to look at it. And so I started working on a book. And I'm a little close to being finished with the book. So I'll finish the book, I'll finish the film, and then I'll try to fix climate change. You know, there's such huge things to be concerned about now that, but I am still trying to get some projects made. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. We would love to see the new movie. When it's going to be?
Oh, well, I'm almost finished. I did the sound mix. I just haven't done the color correction. And then I stopped working on it because I was doing an exhibit of the photographs from the Africa trip, which will be up in 2 weeks down at school at a gallery. And then I'll finish the film, you know, in the next month or something. So, yeah.
Okay, that'll be great. And this is the last question because we don't have that much time. And it's a question about what are you looking, talking about films, what are you looking and what are you liking nowadays? La pregunta final es un poco curiosa de qué es lo que está mirando qué es lo que le está gustando de películas o, sí, o contenidos culturales.
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. We've been in a pandemic. And because of that, mostly my partner and I, we cook, we love to cook. We've cooked really great meals every night for the last 2 years. And we sat in front of the TV watching just all the TV series, you know, not serious cinema, because the stress of work and the pandemic is just like, give me a TV series. So I'm not even going to promote any of them. You all know them. And then I would say the great joy was that I am a very big fan of Kurosawa. And there was a period, like sort of there was Fassbinder at the beginning. And then there was like, you know, Agnes Varda and Kurosawa somewhere 20 years ago, who I discovered and watched all of. And then more recently, there was Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf, the Iranian filmmakers, who would blow my mind. And so I adore Kurosawa. And the Film Forum here had a series 1 month of, I don't know how many films that Toshiro Mifune was the star of. So many Kurosawa films and films by other Japanese directors. And I went to about 9 of the programs, which was also really a joy because people were back in the theaters. And as I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, for 2 years, nobody's been going to the movies and theaters are closing. And a place like the Film Forum is so important to New York and to film culture. And every screening, you know, was almost full. People were in the lobby and it was a great feeling. And also Toshiro Mifune is the most beautiful man I've ever seen. You know, he's so fantastic. So that has been my exciting movie time lately. Yeah. And if anybody wants to watch a Kurosawa that they haven't seen, High and Low as one of the contemporary ones, I mean, set in modern time, and Seven Samurai, of course, one of his most famous. But yeah, he's the best. So.
Thanks so much for being so honest. I think in your work we can see that, and this is one of the things I love of your work. So thank you for being with us and for this conversation. Bueno, esta fue la última pregunta. Le decía a Suke muchas gracias por ser tan honesta. Su trabajo es muy honesto y eso es algo de lo más interesante, una de las partes interesantes de su trabajo y de ver sus materiales. que les cuento nuevamente, se van a poder ver dentro del FEMCINE número 12 en Santiago, en funciones presenciales y en funciones online, a través de femcine.cl. Voy a correr a mi gatito. Y el festival es entre el 22 y el 27 de marzo. Así que muchas gracias por habernos acompañado, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.